This video is a discussion of some of the most significant portions of Aristotle's Posterior analytics. Aristotle's Posterior analytics is a foundational work in epistemology and the philosophy of science that determined the Western paradigm of science for hundreds of years. His conception of scientific knowledge is deeply influenced by previous pioneering work that he did in logic. That is the study of the nature of inferences. We won't be discussing that in much detail here at all, but it is important to know that it's in the background. Logic and the formal argumentation that logic is concerned to systematize determines the ideal form of knowledge for Aristotle. Now, the Greek word that we're talking about here, episteme, could be translated as either knowledge or science in Aristotle, certainly, knowledge or science, depending on the context. Usually we think of science as a deeper, more rigorous, and more systematic form of knowledge. Above all, we tend to think of scientific knowledge as explanatory. Aristotle shares this view. For scientific knowledge, it's not enough merely to know that something is the case. We also need to know why it is. This question is answered by appeal to necessity. Necessity. Scientific knowledge is knowledge of what could not be otherwise because of the intrinsic properties of things. The canonical presentation of such knowledge is in the form of a logical deduction, what's known as the syllogism. So episteme for Aristotle is going to be presented in the form of the syllogism. The syllogism expresses an inferential relationship between universal propositions. So for Aristotle, the canonical form of a scientific demonstration will be something like this. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, all A's are B's, therefore all A's are C's. Logical syllogism that serves to systematize different things and predications in a logically organized way. So this is the example of the syllogism that constitutes scientific knowledge. And this syllogism can be viewed as a way of saying A is C in virtue of B. And this then would be sort of the form of a scientific explanation. Why is A C? Well, A is C in virtue of B, and this is essentially what this expresses as well. So, let's see. We might make this into a particular example, saying that, for example, enclosed figures have area. Triangles are enclosed figures. Therefore, triangles have area, or triangles has area in virtue of being an enclosed figure. This is just something I pulled out of thin air. And you can see that this sort of form of argument, enclosed figures have area, triangles are enclosed figures, therefore triangles have area, or the triangle has area in virtue of being an enclosed figure. This isn't a very exciting scientific explanation. And it's chosen self-consciously to illustrate that for Aristotle, things like arithmetic and geometry are the paradigms of science. And this is, for him, a demonstration of the cause of a triangle having an area. Cause being, for him, an explanation of things. We'll come back to that point. Obviously, this is very simple, but it's the deductive form, the universality and necessity that makes scientific knowledge for Aristotle, not necessarily the complexity of the content. We'll return to that point as well. But let's jump into the selections from the Posterior Analytics. Aristotle holds that all teaching and learning results from pre-existing knowledge. All teaching and learning result from pre-existing knowledge. We can see here the influence of Plato and the doctrine of recollection in the Meno. Recall that in the Meno, Plato addressed an apparent paradox, that it's not possible for a person to inquire neither about what he knows nor about what he doesn't know. He can't inquire into what he knows because he already knows it, so there's no need to inquire anymore. And he can't inquire about what he doesn't know because he doesn't know what he's inquiring about. And Plato's solution, you'll recall, was the doctrine of recollection. However, this committed him to a highly controversial metaphysical theory, someone might say an extravagant metaphysical theory, namely the pre-existence of the soul. So how will Aristotle deal with this issue? Well, according to Aristotle, there are two kinds of prior knowledge. Two kinds of prior knowledge. And he discusses these. This is on page 465 in our text, in the top left-hand column. There are two kinds of prior knowledge that is necessary to have. For some things, it is necessary to assume in advance that they are. For others, it is necessary to understand what the thing being said is, and for some, both. For example, for the principle that everything may be truly affirmed or denied, it is necessary to assume in advance that it is. For triangle, it is necessary to assume in advance that this is what it signifies. And for the unit, both what it signifies and that it is. For each of these is not clear to us in the same way. So that we have two kinds of prior knowledge that he's describing here. The first kind of prior knowledge is the fact that is assumed. And the example he gives is appears to be a version of what's known as the law of the excluded middle. Saying that, how does he put it here again? Everything may be truly affirmed or denied. It seems to be saying here that of every proposition, it's either true or it's false. The law of the excluded middle. Nothing besides those options. So that would be the first kind. The fact that is assumed is the first kind of prior knowledge, and the second is the fact that is understood. And this is his example is the nature of the triangle. So we have the fact that is assumed and the fact that is understood are the two kinds of prior knowledge. And this distinction sets up Aristotle's solution to the Meno paradox. According to his analysis, it's possible for us to already know what we are learning in one way, but not to know it in another. So in the next paragraph after I just read, Aristotle notes that the Meno paradox can be resolved if we note that, quote, it is possible to recognize things one has previously come to know, and also to recognize things simultaneously with acquiring knowledge of them. So evidently this possibility of recognizing things simultaneously with acquiring knowledge of them is the possibility that the Meno paradox overlooks. So, for example, this is Aristotle's example. When we first recognize that the figure that's inscribed in a semicircle is a triangle, we learn something new. So imagine you're doing this geometrical proof and you come to realize that the figure inscribed in the semicircle that you're studying is a triangle. And so you learn something new about the properties of circles and triangles and so on. So you learn this. But at the same time, as you recognize it as a triangle, you also recognize that it has angles equal to 2 right angles. And the latter point is something that Aristotle presumes we already knew. But we knew it, he says, universally, and not as a property of the triangle that is this figure in a semicircle. So what exactly is he saying there? In a sense, he's saying we knew in advance that this figure inscribed in the semicircle has angles equal to 3 right angles, but in a sense we did not, because we didn't know it as the figure inscribed in the semicircle. So learning is possible because, well, we have prior knowledge of a thing in one way, and another way we're ignorant. Okay, so this leads to the first discussion question. Does Aristotle provide a solution to the Meno paradox through his distinction between 2 kinds of prior knowledge? Why or why not? First discussion question. Does Aristotle provide a solution to the Meno paradox through his distinction between 2 kinds of prior knowledge? Why or why not? Okay, in the second chapter of Book 1 of the Posterior Analytics, Aristotle introduces his important theory of demonstrative knowledge. Demonstrative knowledge. So the first paragraph here on the right-hand column on page 465 towards the bottom, first paragraph of chapter 2. We think we have unqualified scientific knowledge of each thing, and not in a sophistical way, which is accidental, when we think we know the cause through which the thing is, as being its cause, and also that this cannot be otherwise than it is. So he's mentioning 2 things here. We know the cause, and we know that the thing cannot be otherwise than it is. Now it is clear that having scientific knowledge is something of this sort. For both those who do not know scientifically and those who do, the former think that they are in this condition, while those who do not know scientifically actually are in this condition, and so that of which there is unqualified scientific knowledge cannot be otherwise than it is. So we have 2 conditions for unqualified scientific knowledge. First, we know the cause through which the thing is as being its cause. That is, we know the cause of the existence of the thing. We know the explanation of why the thing exists. And we know that it is the cause. So we might, it's possible for people to know the cause, but not know that it is the cause. So you might, have a kind of, as it were, unjustified knowledge of the cause of something, but not being able to give an explanation of it. You don't know that it is the cause. And second, we have that the cause cannot be other than it is. In other words, the cause is necessary. Meaning it cannot be otherwise than it is. So those are the 2 conditions of scientific knowledge, unqualified scientific knowledge that he seems to be giving here. We know the cause, and it is necessary. It could not be otherwise than it is. Now, scientific knowledge so conceived will have the character of a demonstration. And a demonstration for Aristotle is going to be a scientific deduction, a logical deduction from starting points or principles, arche is the Greek word, that have certain features. So we have this is going to be a demonstration a scientific or logical deduction and this is going to be based on arche, which are starting points or principles or premises that have certain features. So we'll go through and look at these features. But first, it's scientific knowledge is demonstrative knowledge. It takes the form of a logical argument, a logical deduction that's based upon premises that are special in their kind, based upon starting points, premises, arche, principles. And so what are the features? First, they're true. They have to be true. He says, for it is not possible to have scientific knowledge of what is not. So to base your scientific deduction on a premise that wasn't true would be to base it on something that is not. So it has to be true. Second, it's based upon things that are primary and indemonstrable. Primary, indemonstrable. They must be indemonstrable because if they're not scientifically known themselves, but they're merely known accidentally, they can't provide the basis for a demonstration. So you can't give what you don't have. But since they are to serve as the principles of a demonstration, they themselves cannot be the conclusions of a demonstration. So they have to be primary and demonstrable in those senses. Scientific knowledge is going to be the conclusion of a demonstration, but the premises themselves should be primary and indemonstrable for Aristotle. Third, these should be causes. And here Aristotle is using causes in a broad sense, not to refer to just what later on he would call efficient causality, which is our modern notion of causality, but explanations more broadly. It seems to be simply an axiomatic presumption of Aristotle that scientific knowledge is knowledge of causes. Later, he'll emphasize that science concerns not merely knowing that something is the case, but also why it is the case. In other words, the premises of a deductive demonstration must be such as to explain the conclusion. So they must be causes in that sense. Next, they must be prior. Prior, I put quotes around this because it's a kind of technical term for Aristotle. Prior. By this, it seems that the cause must be prior to what it causes. It's logically prior in that sense. It's not derived from any previous logical deduction, but it is causally prior to what it explains. The cause must be prior to what it causes in that sense, in the sense of logically speaking. Next, it's better known. Better known. And there are two parts to this. He says we understand them, the premises, we understand them, and we know what they are. And initially, this seems as if it may simply refer to what the demonstrator already happens to know. However, Aristotle goes on to distinguish things that are better known to us versus things that are better known in themselves. So there's better known to us and better known in themselves. And here he seems to mean things that are better known in themselves. And this is a notion that actually is quite close and quite similar to it just being true. Things better known to us are things that are more obvious to the ordinary person or perceived through sense perception more clearly or more spontaneously. For example, the sun rises and the sun sets. That's known to us. It's better known to us. But better known in itself, of course, is that the Earth is rotating on its axis, and so faces the sun and then faces away from the sun. That's better known in itself. And so the idea of something being better known in itself is something that is inherently a better paradigm or object of knowledge, or put simply, true. Next is most universal. Most universal. Things that are prior and better known to us are closer, more perceptible particular things. But things that are prior and better known in themselves are more universal and remote things. So why this favoring of the universal? Probably this has to do with the explanatory function of scientific knowledge itself. So what is explanatory is going to explain the particular in terms of the more universal. And this also is closely connected in Aristotle with what is necessary, as we'll see later on. So what is necessary is what has to be the case always, and this is the universal. And then finally, unfortunately for me, because I ran out of board, it has to be, the premises have to be immediate. Immediate. So Aristotle explains this as follows in 466. Towards the bottom, about 6 lines down from the bottom of the left-hand column on 466, he says, an immediate premise is one to which no other premise is prior. A premise is either part of a proposition, one thing predicated of another thing. A dialectical premise is one that assumes either part indifferently, while a demonstrative premise is one that assumes one of them is definitely true. So Aristotle's point here seems to be that the premise in a demonstration is either the affirmation or negation of a proposition as definitely true. So, for example, all men are rational affirms that rationality is part of the intrinsic qualities of men, and it denies that not all men are rational, or that men are not rational universally. So it's immediate in the sense that it is not the logical consequence of anything else. So the mediation here, so in immediate, of course, is contrasted with mediated, and mediated would mean that it is mediated by some other premises. So immediate is one to which no other premise is prior. This, of course, seems to draw a close connection with being prior and being immediate. And it's not exactly clear what exactly the difference is, although I was suggesting that perhaps the priority here idea is that, there's, well, the immediate is that there's nothing prior. So this is sort of a negative of this. It's immediate, meaning that there's nothing prior to it, that it is prior to other things. So this would be something that would follow from the fact that it is always necessarily prior, that it has to be immediate, because otherwise, if it weren't immediate, there would be something prior to it. So these are the characteristics of a demonstration. They're true, they're primary, or indemonstrable, they're causes, they are prior, meaning that they are logically prior to the conclusions. They are better known in themselves, meaning close to something like that they're true, but by this he means that there's something like a paradigm of knowledge. They're most universal, and they're immediate in the sense that nothing is prior to them. Next, Aristotle explains a number of key terms, so we'll look at those next. First, proposition. A proposition for Aristotle is one half of a contradictory pair. One half of a contradictory pair. In other words, it's the affirmation or negation of something that could also be negated if it's an affirmation, or affirmed if it's a negation. So that was the example I just gave of all men are rational. It's a proposition because you could also affirm the negation of that proposition. It is not the case that all men are rational. So that a proposition is always going to have that character. And of course, there can be negative as well as affirmative propositions. The examples of starting points for Aristotle are theses and axioms. So the thesis or an axiom. Space here. A thesis cannot be proved, but it is epistemically dispensable or optional in the sense that a person doesn't need it in order to know anything at all. So, hypotheses and definitions are types of theses. Hypothesis. Hypothesis assumes that something does or does not exist. And a definition is a thesis that does not assume that something is. So he's using hypothesis in a slightly different sense from our modern sense in which we talk about scientific hypotheses, which we tend to think of as things that can be proved. But hypothesis for him is something more like just like a hypothesis or supposition is used as a heuristic tool for the sake of unfolding an explanation or something like that. Axioms for Aristotle are needed to know anything at all. Presumably principles such as identity, excluded middle, non-contradiction would be of this kind. The way Aristotle conceives of a demonstration, it's based upon affirmations that can also be contradicted. The cogency or purposiveness, the cogency or persuasiveness of a demonstration relies on the fact that the premises will be better known than the opposites. Thus, the conclusion of a demonstration will always be better known than the demonstrations based upon contrary propositions. Okay, so that's his idea of demonstrative knowledge and the building blocks of demonstrative knowledge. Next, Aristotle takes up a skeptical challenge to the idea of scientific knowledge. The problem stems from combining the notion that the primary things, that is the starting points, the premises of a scientific demonstration, must themselves be known scientifically, with the notion that scientific knowledge must always be demonstrated. So you have on the one hand this idea premises of a scientific demonstration must be known scientifically, and then the idea that scientific knowledge must be demonstrated. So based on what we've seen so far, these two propositions, that premises of a scientific demonstration must themselves be known scientifically and that scientific knowledge must be demonstrated, both seem to be propositions that Aristotle should hold. Certainly he, up to now, seems like he's been saying that scientific knowledge must be demonstrated, that is, it must follow as the conclusion of a logical deduction. And it also seems quite natural or reasonable to think that, well, the premises of a scientific deduction themselves must be scientifically sound premises. And what can that mean other than that they are known scientifically themselves? But if they're known scientifically, then according to this, scientific knowledge has to be demonstrated, so they have to be demonstrated. And the problem with this is that the combination of these two assumptions leads to two apparently unpalatable options. Either it suggests, if you put these two together, that we're left with an infinite regress or a circular demonstration. That it's to say, if you combine these two, you affirm both of them, aren't you left in a situation where you have either an infinite regress or a circular demonstration? And Aristotle regards both of these as unacceptable options. The people who favor an infinite regress, it seems like he thinks they wind up as skeptics about scientific knowledge, about the very possibility of scientific knowledge. So let's read some of this from chapter 3. Some think that there is no scientific knowledge because the primary things must be known scientifically, while others think that there is, but that there is a demonstration of everything. Neither of these views is either true or necessary. For those who hypothesize that there is no scientific knowledge at all maintain that there is an infinite regress, supposing that people cannot have scientific knowledge of what was posterior via what is prior when there is nothing primary. And they are right, for it is impossible to get through an infinite number of things. Or alternatively, if the regress stops and there are starting points, these must be unknown, since there is no demonstration of them. Which is the only thing these things people say is to have scientific knowledge. But if it is not possible to know the primary things, neither is it possible unqualifiedly or strictly to have scientific knowledge of what is based on them, but only on the hypothesis that the other things are the case. The other group agrees about knowing scientifically, for they hold that it exists only through demonstration, but that nothing prevents there from being demonstration of everything, since circular demonstration can occur and things can be demonstrated from one another. But then he goes on to say, skipping this paragraph next and skipping to the top of 467 on the right-hand column, that it is impossible to demonstrate unqualifiedly by circular proof is clear, since in fact demonstration must be based on things that are prior and better known, for it is impossible for the same things to be simultaneously prior and posterior to the same things, unless they are so in different ways, as some things are prior in relation to us, where others are unqualifiedly prior, which is how induction makes something known. But if that were the case, unqualified knowing would not have been defined well, but there would be two kinds of it. Or rather, the other kind of demonstration, since it comes to be what it is from what is better known to us, it is not unqualified demonstration. The consequence for those who say that there is circular demonstration is not only what has just been said, but also that they are saying nothing else that if this is the case, if this is the case. They're also saying nothing else than that this is the case, if this is the case. But this way, it is easy to prove everything. So the people who favor an infinite regress wind up as skeptics about scientific knowledge, doubting its very possibility, because they say, well, either you have an infinite regress and you never have a demonstration at all, because the demonstration has to be finite, or you end up by saying, well, the premises aren't known. But then how on earth could you ever derive any scientific knowledge from things that aren't known? That is absurd. So they end up as being skeptics about scientific knowledge. The other group shares the first group's combining of these two notions, but they favor the idea of a circular demonstration, evidently where the starting points are proved from each other. But Aristotle rejects this as well, since it makes the same things both prior and posterior to one another, both logically prior and logically posterior. And this is like saying, this is the case because this is the case, he says, which makes it too easy to prove anything. So the way out of this dilemma for Aristotle is to deny that all scientific knowledge is demonstrable. And this is what he says in the paragraph that I skipped earlier. But we say that not all scientific knowledge is demonstrative, but that scientific knowledge of immediates is indemonstrable. Scientific knowledge of immediates is indemonstrable. Remember, the immediates are the one to which no other premise is prior. That this is necessary is evident, for if it is necessary to have scientific knowledge of the things that are prior and on which the demonstration depends, but these stop at some point, these immediates must be indemonstrable. This is our position on these matters, and we declare that there is not only scientific knowledge, but also a starting point of scientific knowledge by which we recognize the definitions. So there's two kinds of knowledge. There's scientific knowledge, and then there's there's two kinds of scientific knowledge, he wants to say. And again, write this way. The first is the demonstrative, and the second is immediate, knowledge of these immediates. So there's two kinds of scientific knowledge. So in this respect, then he rejects the premise of these people that say that all scientific knowledge must be demonstrative. That's not the case. There is another kind of scientific knowledge, namely this kind, knowledge of the immediate. But this obviously raises the problem. If not all scientific knowledge is demonstrative knowledge, what is this other type of scientific knowledge, and what makes it scientific? And Aristotle's answer to this question is delayed until Book 2 of the Posterior Analytics. Moving on to Chapter 4, Book 1. In this chapter, Aristotle narrows his focus to one characteristic of scientific knowledge, namely its necessity. Scientific knowledge has to be necessary. So what do we mean in saying it's necessary? He says on this page 468 in the left-hand column in our text, what is known scientifically by demonstrative scientific knowledge must be necessary. What is it for it to be necessary? He casts out this notion in three aspects in which something obtains or belongs to something. So necessity is involved when it obtains or belongs in every case, intrinsically, and universally. Necessary is what obtains in every case, intrinsically and universally. Aristotle writes that whatever is not such as to apply in some cases but not others, at some times but not at others, I say belongs in every case. So this notion in every case seems to be pretty straightforward. To belong in every case is simply to hold true of all cases at all times. So Aristotle's first example of this is that being an animal holds of every human being at all times. That's in every case. Another is that there's a point in every line. Next, Aristotle considers things that belong intrinsically. Intrinsically. And this is a little more complicated. Yeah, it turns out for Aristotle that one thing belongs to another thing intrinsically when it satisfies four conditions. So we can write this out this way. Say A belongs to B intrinsically when, first of all, the essence of B depends upon A. This is the first condition. The essence of B depends upon A, as in like the essence of triangle depends upon line. The essence of triangle depends upon line. So line belongs to triangle intrinsically. Second, the account that specifies what it is to be B refers to A. The account that specifies what it is to be B refers to A. So the account of what a triangle is refers to lines. That's the idea. Or to angles. So those lines and angles belong intrinsically for that reason. A is not said of B as of a subject. A is not said of B as of a subject. Here the idea is A is not said of B as of a subject. So some underlying substance inseparable from the intrinsic thing. Excuse me. It's not said of A is not said of B as if B were an underlying substance that's separable from A. The lines of the triangle are the triangle, unlike, say, the whiteness of Socrates, which could be said of Socrates as of a subject, and so be separable. And then 4, A belongs to B because of itself. And he uses the rather morbid example, when something dies because its throat was cut. Be honest with you, I'm not quite sure I get that example. A belongs to B because of itself. I guess the idea is that the dying and having the throat cut is sort of one event. I guess is maybe the point there. So it belongs to B because of itself. So those are the 4 notions of intrinsic. Once again, the A belongs to B intrinsically when the essence of B depends upon A. The account that specifies what it is to be B refers to A. A is not said of B as of a subject, and A belongs to B because of itself. In that case, A belongs to B intrinsically. And all of this is just the second aspect of necessity. And then, in Aristotle's terminology, if something belongs intrinsically and in every case, then it belongs universally. So the point seems to be add these two together and you get universally. Something that belongs in every case and intrinsically belongs to it universally. And that's what belonging necessarily amounts to. So that's an important aspect of Aristotle's theory of demonstration, that it contains premises that are necessary. In chapter 5, Aristotle notes that if errors in scientific demonstrations are to be avoided, the deduction must be based upon the primary subject, not on secondary subjects. So, for example, if you want to prove that something holds true of the triangle universally, we must proceed by first abstracting from everything that does not belong to the idea of the triangle as such. If we, in error, decided to take just the isosceles triangle as our example of a triangle and build our demonstrations of what belongs to a triangle on that, of course, will not reach valid results. We can only do that if we consider only those features that belong to the triangle universally. So that's a pretty straightforward point. In chapter 6, Aristotle next outlines some additional features of a scientific demonstration. So he says that a demonstration has to be based upon premises that are necessary, not merely reputable or true. He says it must be a primary fact in the genus which the proof concerns. Aristotle emphasizes that a demonstration must be a true explanation. That is, it must answer the question why. And the way a demonstration does this is through a particular argument form known as a syllogism. But as I've already mentioned, the Aristotelian syllogism consists canonically of two premises and a conclusion. And it's a property of the syllogism that it preserves in the conclusion the necessity contained in the premises. So Aristotle gives the following example here. All B's are A's. All C's are B's. Oops. Therefore, all C's are A's. So this is sort of the premises and the conclusion. This is in the syllogism. That's the standard. Now, two important points about this for Aristotle. There's this concept of the middle, which is the term shared between the premises. So B here is the middle. And this is the explanatory factor. The explanation is based on this factor. So you can think of it this way. If you're asking, suppose you're asking the question, why are all C's A's? And the answer would be, well, because all C's are B's and all B's are A's. That's why all C's are A's. So if you let, let's say C equals men, B equals animals, and A equals living things, you can get the flavor of how this would go. I'll let you try that one out for yourself. Now, Aristotle acknowledges that it is possible to have a syllogism where the premises aren't necessary, but if the premises are necessary, then the necessity will be preserved in the conclusion as well. And that's, for Aristotle, what's properly scientific. In chapter 10, Aristotle lays out some common constitutive features of every science. So every science is going to be based upon principles. Principles are the starting points of a science from which the demonstrations that make up the body of knowledge of that science proceed. Some of the principles that are used in a demonstrative science are going to be specific to that particular science, and some are going to be common to all sciences. So, for example, a principle specific to geometry would be the principle specifying the nature of a line. A principle common to all sciences is that if equals are subtracted from equals, the remainder is equal. He says that every demonstrative science is concerned with three things. So, every demonstrative science is concerned with, first of all, the genus. The genus, which are the things it posits to exist. The things it posits to exist. Those things that it posits or assumes to exist, the attributes of which the science investigates. So, for example, geometry assumes points and lines exist. The genus is the things that it posits, the things that it assumes to exist. Next is the next is the axioms or common principles. The axioms or common principles are the premises from which it forms its demonstrations, which we've been talking about, of course. And then third are the attributes concerning which it assumes what each signifies, he says. The attributes. In other words, these attributes are the intrinsic attributes of the posited things. So in other words, it assumes that the positive things have certain attributes as part of the meaning of what it's talking about. So those are the three aspects of demonstrative science: the genus, the axioms or common principles, and the attributes. In scientific investigation, sometimes it will be necessary to provisionally introduce unproven propositions. A proposition, unlike a definition, asserts the existence or non-existence of something. A proposition that can be proved but unproven is called a postulate. So we have postulates, we have propositions, asserts existence or non-existence. And then we have postulates. A postulate is something that can be proved but is unproven. And then hypothesis is a postulate that is adopted by someone. So that's what these three terms refer to. Their proposition, the existence, something that asserts the existence or non-existence of something. A postulate is a proposition that can be proved but is unproven. An hypothesis is when someone adopts a postulate. So that's Aristotelian scientific terminology. Now, there's going to be a difference, whereas postulates and hypotheses are either universal or particular. Definitions are different in that they are neither universal nor particular for Aristotle. And they don't assert or deny existence. So definition is different. For Aristotle, definition isn't a proposition. It's just sort of spelling out the as we'll see, there are couple different types of definitions, but a definition are not hypotheses. That's the key point here. It's one thing to hypothesize something, to assert in an unproven fashion something, and it's another thing to define something for Aristotle. Okay. This brings us to book 2. Previously, we've seen that knowing what a thing is consists of knowing the reason or the cause, the explanation for why it exists. And this knowledge takes the form of a demonstration in which this linking middle term provides the explanation. Now here, Aristotle considers, and this is chapter 8 of book 2, he considers the following example. He says, Let A stand for eclipse. Let C stand for moon. And let B stand for the Earth screening. The screening from the light of the moon. And suppose we ask a question in a scientific investigation: is the moon being eclipsed or not? And if we have an account of an eclipse as the Earth's screening of the light of the moon, that is, if we have an account that A is B, then to investigate this question is to investigate whether B obtains. And this is the same thing as investigating whether the account holds. So if we have an account like this: A is B, C is B, and C is A, then he says that the investigation into whether the moon is in eclipse is the same as the question of whether the account holds. To investigate the question is to investigate whether B obtains. And that's the same as investigating whether our account of this holds. So the idea is that we learn both the fact and the explanation at the same time when we have the true account. However, it's possible for there to be another type of case in which we know the fact but without the explanation. So if we let A stand for eclipse again, C for moon, and B for the inability of the moon to cast a shadow. So we notice that the moon is unable to cast a shadow, but we don't know why. Right? So we change the case up, so now we have that. Aristotle observes, when it is clear that A belongs to C, to investigate why it belongs is to investigate what B is. That is, it's to ask the question like, is the moon unable to cast a shadow because of the Earth's screaming, because of the Earth's screening, or because of the moon's turning, or because its fire is extinguished? So we have different possibilities for B. And so Aristotle's point seems to be that the natural phenomenon becomes clear once a demonstration is possible, such that one can say A is B, that is, an eclipse is the Earth's screening, C is B, the moon is being screened by the Earth, and C is A, the moon is in an eclipse. That's the scientific explanation. If we don't have a value, so to speak, for B, but we just have a kind of appearance, or what is known to us, but not what is true in itself, then we're not going to have the scientific explanation. We have to investigate what the value is for B. So the point is that the form of a scientific investigation, it seems, is going to be that we're going to have to seek, what's this value? The scientific explanation is made possible here by a B that is such that it can unite A and C, which is what the idea of the Earth screening does, but the idea that the moon is unable to cast a shadow doesn't do. So you need the kind of B that's going to be able to unite A and C, and then you have the scientific explanation. Chapter 9. Aristotle remarks that of some things the cause is different from the things, and of others it is not. He seems to be positing here that there could be a thing that was its own cause, that is, that explained itself. Evidently, this would be a thing whose essence, or what it is, would be self-explanatory or self-evident, that would be immediate in itself. What could possibly be such a thing? He suggests that perhaps the unit is like this in arithmetic. It's immediately self-evident that there are units and that they exist. In Part 2, Chapter 10, Aristotle distinguishes between two types of definition. In general, a definition is an account of the what it is or the essence of a thing. However, this may take two different forms. The first is the account of what the name or the name-like formula signifies. For example, the name thunder signifies a noise in the clouds. Notice that this type of definition only concerns what the language user means by the term. It doesn't explain anything about what thunder actually is as a natural phenomenon. It just explains what we're referring to when we're talking about this thing that we experience. And historically, this kind of definition will be known as a nominal definition. A nominal definition. And you can see that this is from the Latin word for name. A nominal definition is just a kind of a name that we give to something. And it defines what this name signifies. The contrast with this would be a real definition. The second kind of definition is an account that shows why it exists and is like a demonstration. In other words, this kind of definition is actually in itself a kind of a scientific explanation, whereas this would not be. This is just a kind of exercise in linguistic analysis, whereas this is actually a scientific explanation. So this is the account that shows why it exists. So for example, thunder may be defined as the extinguishing of fire in the clouds. And let's suppose that's the real essence of thunder, as Aristotle at his level of scientific understanding is presupposing. This kind of definition is known as a real definition. It's the one that is the true scientific definition of the thing, since it contains the scientific account of what the thing really is, not just the way we speak about it. So real definitions and scientific demonstrations are transmutable into one another. Each one can be constructed out of the other. Finally, in Book 2, Chapter 19, Aristotle returns to the proposal he originally made in Book 1, Chapter 3, in response to the problem of the starting points. Remember, the problem was that if all scientific knowledge is supposed to be demonstrative knowledge, how can the starting points be known? And Aristotle's reply was to deny that all scientific knowledge is demonstrative. Remember, we have two types of scientific knowledge. There's the demonstrative knowledge, and then there's knowledge of the immediates. But there he failed to explain how there can be any other kind of scientific knowledge. And this is the challenge he finally takes up in Book 2, Chapter 19. He considers the possibility that we possess the first principles of demonstration innately from birth, but ultimately he rejects this notion. So it could be that we have this kind of innate knowledge of the starting points, and that's how we know them. But he says, in that case, we have knowledge more precise than demonstration, but are unaware of it. We have knowledge more precise than demonstration, but are unaware of it. You know, presumably when we're babies and small children, we have knowledge that's logically prior to what is demonstrative scientific knowledge. But that he regards as being absurd. The only alternative, Aristotle surmises, is our capacity for sense perception. Sense perception. So he writes, second to last paragraph on the bottom of page 474, left-hand column. Now it is evident that we cannot possess them and that they cannot come to be in us, he's speaking of the starting points, if we are ignorant and possess no such state. Therefore, we must possess some capacity, but not one that will be more valuable than those states in respect of precision. And this is evidently something that belongs to all animals, for they possess a congenital capacity of discerning that we call perception. So our capacity for sense perception is where we get these starting points from. But it's not immediate, it's through a kind of procedure. So first we have sense perception. And sense perception leads to memory. After perceiving, he says, there occurs a persistence of the percept, and we preserve something in our soul. So the the thing that we perceive, the percept is the term for it, is preserved in our soul through memory, and that leads to experience. And when this happens many times, memories that are many in number constitute a single experience. And this gives rise to a universal in the soul. Which is the starting point of scientific knowledge. So this is the procedure. We have sense perceptions. The percept is preserved in memory. When we have several such percepts, that constitutes experience, and out of experience, a universal arises in the soul. Top of the right-hand column of page 474. So from perception, memory comes about, as we say, and from memory of the same thing occurring many times comes experience. For memories many in number constitute a single experience. From experience, or when the entire universal has come to be at rest in the soul, the one beside the many, whatever is one and the same in them all, the starting point of art and science comes about. The starting point of art, if it is concerned with coming to be, but the starting point of science if it is concerned with what is. So the states of scientific knowledge are not present in us as determinate states, nor do they arise from still other higher cognitive states, but from perception. As in a battle after a rout has occurred, when one man comes to a stand, another does too, and then another, until it reaches a starting point. And in fact, the soul is such that it can be affected in this way. So you get this picture where through sense perception, all these little percepts come back, they come out, until they form a kind of battle line, which is experience, and then out of that comes the universal. Then something comes to a stand. We get the universal in the soul. So in other words, repeated experience of similar things retained in memory generates a universal in the soul, which can then be the starting point of a scientific demonstration. All knowledge for Aristotle will be based upon this kind of repeated experience. And this is something that it seems close to being described as knowledge by induction. Induction, that is, repeated experience of similar cases leads us to general truths about the world. So in other words, we start with repeated particulars, and from that we get a universal generalization. That is induction. However, there's still a final stage of this, which is what Aristotle calls nous, or understanding. Nous, or understanding. That is, it's not enough just for the universal to arise in the soul from repeated experience, but we have to have an understanding of this universal. The universals that have been generated by experience must be grasped as such by the mind. It's this kind of understanding that is the starting point of scientific knowledge. So this suggests a two-stage method of science for Aristotle. First, we arrive at universal truths through induction, through generalization from repeated instances of types of cases. And then secondly, we systematize these truths through logical demonstrations, which provide the explanations of the truths. We generalize from induction, then we systematize and deduce the explanations. This leads to a second discussion question. Does Aristotle's account of the starting points of a scientific demonstration allow him to avoid the problems of regress or circularity in a scientific demonstration? Do the starting points that we can derive from sense perception have the features that Aristotle earlier had required of the premises of a scientific demonstration? For example, being immediate, universal, better known, prior, and so on. Why or why not? So this is the second discussion question once again. Does Aristotle's account of the starting points of a scientific demonstration allow him to avoid the problems of regress or circularity in a scientific demonstration? Do the starting points that we can derive from sense perception have the features that Aristotle had earlier required of the premises of a scientific demonstration, being immediate, universal, better known, prior, etc.? Why or why not?